Hello, today I will be teaching the social, political and economic reforms of Korea. While Koreans have often been portrayed in modern history as either passive victims of imperialism or engaged in a nationalistic struggle against the Japanese oppression, colonial era, Korea presented two versions of what it means to be modern: Japan's own version and the one from the West. Educational development took place in Korea. Koreans were hardly reluctant to accept new styles of schooling, seeing it as a way of advancing in a changing society. Education was flourishing by less than 2 decades of chosen period from 1890 to 1910. Hundreds of new schools were established by Koreans and by foreign missionaries, while the state was beginning to create a national system of public education. The colonial regime sought to gain control over schooling and to channel it towards serving Japan's aims, primarily to provide basic schooling for unskilled and semi-skilled laborers. In 1911, the Japanese administration created a new educational system that provided up to 14 years of schooling for Japanese residents, but limited public education for most Koreans to 4 years of common school, with a few for high common school. So, the national education system was introduced in Korea, which mostly focused on vocational education. So, vocational education was given importance in colonial Korea. According to the Education Ordinance, the purpose of the educational system for Koreans was to give the younger generation of Koreans such moral character and general knowledge as will make them loyal subject of Japan, at the same time enable them to cope up with the present condition existing in the peninsula. Tight restrictions were placed over the hundreds of private modern style schools that mushroomed in the early 20th century. Many Koreans run schools were forced to close because they were unable to provide the Japanese language or Japanese system of education. The colonial authorities closed these type of schools. With the new, more liberal cultural policy, a major reform of educational policy took place in 1922 that extended elementary education from 4 to 6, sometimes 5 years, and secondary education to 5 years, while adding a 3-year college preparatory or advanced technical school. The pace of educational expansion failed to meet the public needs. In response, Koreans established hundreds of unlicensed schools. Many of these schools were night schools. So, night school was also introduced in Korea, taught by the young graduates and public or mission-run educational institution. Traditional village schools known as Sodang flourish. So, Sodang flourished during the period we were talking. Frustration at the gradualistic approach to education development was felt most keen by the members of elite and the small but growing urban middle class. The Kaijo Imperial University was established in 1925, remained the sole university in Korea until after 1945. The Japanese colonial authority did not monopolize schooling in Korea. Private schools, many operated by the American missionaries or American trained Koreans, survived. In 1935, 73.6% of post-secondary education was carried out by private schools and non-university institutions. In 1942, there were 6,771 Koreans attending institutions of higher education in Japan. The rising demand for modern type of schooling reflected the social change in Korea. The country's old order began to crumble with the Kobo reforms of 1894-95 that legally abolished the rigid and hereditary social structure of chosen dynasty of Korea. It accelerated during the colonial period with the rise of an industrial working class and a new middle class, the emerging of social movement among the women and outcast, an acceleration of social mobility. The new industrial working class grew slowly at first. There were 99,000 factory workers in 1933 and 390,000 in 1943. The industrial workers included large number of women, generally confined to menial and respective sectors of the industry. The growth of industry is reflected in the urban population. The Korean workers, rather than being passive victims, often showed a surprisingly militancy, participating in labor agitation. After 1920, labor strikes increased. The most famous was the Wonson General Strike that took place in 1929. The politicization of labor movements in South Korea, intervention into the labor management relations by the government, and the prevalence of company unions were all influenced by wartime colonial practice. A small middle class emerged in colonial Korea. The class included professionals such as teachers, doctors, accountants, businessmen, bankers, and civil servants in colonial bureaucracy. This group wore Western style of clothes and they should send their children to modern school, and they read newspapers, magazines, and they also read modern literature by foreign writers in translation or by Korean writers such as Yang Kwang-soo. Members of the middle class were urban, cosmopolitan, and open to new ideas. Few social changes marked a great break with the tradition, those that were concerned with women. Many Korean women embraced new ideas and opportunities presented by a modernizing society. The Kobo reforms had abolished some of the legal restrictions on women. In 1920s, men and women participated in discussions about the role of women and gender relation. The women's movement was quite political. Moderate women reformers were associated with YWCA and various church and moderate patriotic associations. Another marginalized group that took advantage of the new opportunities were the Pak Kwang Hong, a low status hereditary group in Korea who lived in their own villages. Very much like the untouchables, they were socially stunned by ordinary citizens possessing a legal status as mean people below the ordinary peasants or even slaves. Their social status improved during the social upheavals of 1930s. Most of the peasants worked for landlords as tenant farmers. A major change was commercialization of agriculture, a change that began with the opening of Korean ports after 1876 and accelerated during the colonial rule. Landlord-tenant disputes were frequent. A traditional racialism began especially strong in North, as well as a legacy of bitterness and frustration among tenant farmers that emerged after the end of the colonial rule in 1945. Economic reforms. The Korea's economy grew considerably under the colonial rule, although the extent to which the colonial period laid the foundation of its economic transformation after 1945 is controversial. Japan did build an elaborate infrastructure and industrial base in Korea and modernize agriculture, but it did so in a way that often minimized the benefits of Korea and created structural problems. At the end of the colonial rule, Korea still remained rural. The period between 1919 to 1920 marked an important turning point in Korea's economic development. Japan emerged at the end of the World War I from a debitor to a creditor nation. Capital-rich Japanese companies now sought to invest in Korea and pressurized the Japanese government to abolish the tariffs in 1920 that had largely closed Koreans to investment. The period was also a turning point because merchants and landlords in Korea who had accumulated capital began to actively participate in modern industry. Most Korean intellectuals saw commerce and industry as a source of national strength. Among the pioneer Korean owned industry was the Kongsong Cord Company, founded in 1910 by the aristocratic Yoon family and becoming a joint stock company in 1911. To accompany industrialization, an impressive infrastructure was built. After 1910, railway construction continued and was coordinated with the development of Japanese-owned South Manchurian Railway Company in northeast China, which took over the management of Korea's railway route in 1933. By 1945, Koreans had one of the most extensive railway networks in Asia. During 1930s, with the Japanese conquest of Manchuria and then the invasion of China, the industrialization of Korea accelerated. New industrial cities sprang up in the north. The economic activity during the colonial period had some unfortunate ecological consequences. Political reforms. Despite the country's loss of independence, this period brought about important changes that marked the birth of modern Korea. Korea's entry into the world of imperialism profoundly altered society. By the early 20th century, the force of modernization was felt throughout the country. From July 1894 to February 1896, the Korean reformers, under the sponsorship of the Japanese, enacted a sweeping series of laws and regulations that marked a sharp break in the country's historical tradition. In the late July 1894, the Japanese reformers created a deliberative council with 17 and later 23 members. It was the principal organ for carrying out the sweeping reconstructing of the government and society. Important conservative officials were appointed to largely powerless Privy Council. The State Council was replaced by a cabinet style organization with a prime minister. New ministries were created to deal with foreign affairs, home, finance, justice, education, defense, agriculture, commerce and industry. Much of the authority of the king was removed to the new cabinet and to the prime minister. So the power of the prime minister became very important during this period. The affairs of the court were separated from the rest of the government and administered by a department of royal household affairs. The government was rationalized by a clear separation of the judicial and the military function from the civil ones. It enacted laws that established a separate hierarchy of courts and issued decrees. The government created new capital and provincial police system and made plans to rationalize the tax system. It abolished arbitrary taxes and merchant monopolies. The colonial regime maintained Korea's administrative division into 13 provinces, which were subdivided into 200 counties and municipalities. Countries were subdivided into district, villages and hamlets. The Governor General appointed all the provincial governors and country superintendents. So there was a total reorganization of the political power in Korea during the colonial period. The power of the prime minister became very important. There were different cabinet ministers, different departments to administer the country. There was a rational tax system. There was clear administrative divisions into 13 provinces. Provinces were again subdivided into 200 counties, municipalities, district, subdivision, villages, and there were governor general who appointed all provincial governors and country superintendent. So during the colonial period, colonial Korea had a drastic change in the political system of the country. To summarize the social, political and economic reforms of Korea, in social arena, Korea had great changes. Education system was modernized, new system of schooling was started, schooling became compulsory, the Kaijo University was established, and people were very much eager to read newspapers, to read literature and go to the schools and colleges. There were night school, traditional school known as Sodang, which also started during this period. Another very important thing which took place during this period was that elementary education became very important during this period, which started from 4 to 6, and again secondary education which started from 5 years, while adding 3 years of college, preparatory or advanced technical education. On the other hand, vocational education was also given great importance during this period. Education on moral lines was given importance. Another thing, educational system opened by American missionaries or by American trained Korean. So there was a really demand for the modern style of schooling, which reflected a social change in Korea. The country's old order began to crumble with the Kobo reforms of 1894-95. On the other hand, a new industrial middle class or working class also emerged in Korea. Women were gaining importance in the social movement, and also outcasts were also gaining importance in the social movement of Korea. The industrial working class that emerged in Korea were women, doctors, teachers, accountant. On the other hand, the small middle class which emerged in colonial Korea, which included professionals also like teachers, doctors, bankers, civil servants, etc. This group wore Western clothes and they sent their children to modern states. So, urban middle class, a very cosmopolitan middle class also emerged in Korea. On the other hand, it seems that missionaries took a great role in modernizing the school system. Moderate women reformers were also associated with YWCA and various church and moderate patriotic associations. Another marginalized group that emerged in Korea was the Pakong, which was of lower status, which was like the untouchables, and they were known as mean people. They became very important during this period. So, a major change was the commercialization of agriculture, which accelerated the phase of agricultural development. Korea's economy also developed with great pace, and there was a great change in the economic structure of Korea. There was industrialization in Korea, modernization in agriculture, and there were structural changes in the industrial aspect. Economic development became very important during 1930. At the end of the First World War, Japan emerged from a country of debitor to a country of creditor. So there was a great change in Korean industrial structure. Japanese capitalists started investing in Korea, and modern industrial development took place during this period. And among the pioneer Korean owned industry, there was the Kongsong Company, which was founded in 1910 by the aristocratic Yeon class, and they became a joint stock company. So there was a great industrial change and impressive infrastructural development in Korea, which brought Korea to a phase of new era. On the other hand, political reforms were also noticed in Korea, and the prime minister became very important. There were cabinet of minister who were looking after the administrative system of Korea. There was also the different departments also increased during this period, like the finance department, Department of Justice, Department of Education, Commerce and Industry Department, and a new Department of Royal Household Affairs was also started in Korea, and judiciary was separated from civil administration, military and judiciary were separated, and there was pace in which the total activity in Korea had brought about great change during the colonial period.